How could you be so selfish? My father's voice boomed across the polished wood floors of our family's Aspen vacation home. His face was red, his fists clenched. Your brother needs this money to stabilize his future. Maddie, you have more than enough. Why are you suddenly acting like this? I stood frozen, my heart pounding, my fingers tightening around the crisp white envelope I had just picked up from the coffee table. The words on the document sent a chill down my spine. Nathan Carter, Trust Fund, $450. My stomach dropped. My mind raced. This was the same man who, for years, told me there wasn't enough money to help with my college tuition. The same man who watched me work 2 jobs just to keep a roof over my head. The same father who had no problem expecting me to foot the bill for their lavish vacations, their rising property taxes, and even Nathan's credit card debt, while secretly funneling nearly $500,000 into my brother's future. I swallowed hard, my voice steady but cold. When were you going to tell me about this? Silence. And in that moment, I realized I had been played for a fool. But that ended today. I stared at my father, waiting for an answer, but the silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. My mother shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her gaze locked on her lap, as if refusing to acknowledge the weight of the betrayal hanging in the air. And Nathan? He barely looked up from his phone, as if the revelation that nearly $500,000 had been tucked away for him was nothing more than an expected convenience. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't new to them. They had always known. I was the only fool who hadn't seen it. A bitter laugh escaped my lips as memories began to flood my mind. I thought back to my 16th birthday. I had been so excited, hoping, praying, that maybe I'd finally get a car like my friends had. But when I walked outside that morning, all that was waiting for me was a hand-me-down laptop and a lecture about how I needed to be responsible for my own future. 2 years later, Nathan turned 16, and guess what? A brand new BMW sat in the driveway, wrapped in a giant red bow. My parents had smiled, beaming with pride, as he revved the engine like he had earned it. It's different for him, Maddie, my mother had said when I questioned it. You're the independent one. You've always figured things out on your own. At the time, I believed her. I convinced myself that maybe it was about timing, about circumstances. But now, as I stood in this grand vacation home, the very one I had been paying property taxes on for years, it all became painfully clear. Nathan had never needed to figure things out, because he had me, and I let them do it. Over and over again, I thought back to college, how I had spent 4 years juggling classes, 2 part-time jobs, and endless sleepless nights, while Nathan partied his way through an expensive private university, fully funded by our parents. When my rent skyrocketed after graduation, I had no choice but to take on extra consulting work just to afford a tiny studio apartment in the city. Meanwhile, Nathan moved into a sleek downtown loft, rent-free, paid for by family contributions. And still, I had given, because that's what family does, right? They'd call, and I'd help. My dad needed me to cover an emergency repair on the Aspen house. Done. My mom's medical bill wasn't fully covered by insurance. I transferred the money without hesitation. Nathan maxed out yet another credit card? Maddie, he's just struggling right now. And I had believed them. Every single time. But standing here now, looking at that damn trust fund document, I felt something inside me snap. Before I tell you what happened next, the moment that left my father completely speechless, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something that should have been rightfully yours, hit that like button, because trust me, this story is just getting started. I gripped the trust fund document tightly, my fingers pressing into the crisp paper as the weight of years of betrayal settled onto my chest. My father sat across from me, his expression a mix of frustration and entitlement, as if my reaction to discovering this massive trust fund for Nathan was nothing more than an overreaction. My mother, still silent, refused to look up. And Nathan? He exhaled sharply, shifting in his seat like this whole confrontation was nothing more than an inconvenience. He wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't even grateful. He was annoyed, annoyed that I was making a big deal out of something he clearly believed was his right. That was it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. I reached for my phone. My hands steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. With a few quick taps, my finance app opened, revealing years' worth of transactions, every payment, every favor, every debt I had settled under the guise of helping the family. I scrolled through the list, the numbers staring back at me like proof of my own foolishness. My voice was calm when I finally spoke. Property taxes, $53.800. My father shifted in his chair. Nathan's car payments, $18. Nathan scoffed, shaking his head. Oh, come on, Maddie, you act like you're broke. I ignored him. House renovations and emergency maintenance, $15. Silence. I could feel the energy in the room shift. The air thick with an unspoken tension as my mother finally glanced up. Her eyes flickering with something that looked almost like guilt. I wasn't finished. Miscellaneous expenses, credit card payments, vacations, unexpected costs, $39.700. I paused, letting the total sink in before delivering the final blow. $126,500. That's how much I've given to this family over the years. And what have I gotten in return? The room remained silent. My father leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple as if this conversation was exhausting him. Maddie, you've always been successful. You have a great career. A great life. This money, these contributions, they don't affect you the way they would affect Nathan. He's still finding his way. I let out a short, bitter laugh. Finding his way? Nathan, who had never paid a single bill in his life. Nathan, whose reckless spending had been covered time and time again while I was expected to be responsible. To be the one who always had things figured out? My entire life had been built around their expectations, their needs, their demands, while they quietly secured a future for him and left me to fend for myself. Nathan stretched his arms lazily, looking more bored than anything else. You're acting like you're some kind of victim. It's just money. Maddie, you have plenty. What's the big deal? My fingers curled into fists. He didn't get it. He never would. And why would he? He had spent his entire life believing that money would always be there for him. That when things went wrong, someone else, whether it was our parents or me, would fix it. The entitlement was staggering, and the worst part was that my father saw nothing wrong with it. I looked at the property tax bill sitting in the middle of the table. The same bill they had so casually expected me to cover yet again. I reached for it, flipped it over, folded it neatly, and placed it back down. No, I said simply. My father frowned. No? I met his gaze without hesitation. No, I'm not paying it. I'm not paying for anything. Not anymore. Nathan finally sat forward, his relaxed posture disappearing. My father straightened in his chair, his jaw tightening. Maddie, be reasonable. Reasonable? I repeated, my voice cold. You want to talk about reasonable? Because what's not reasonable is expecting me to take care of this family while you funnel money into a trust fund for Nathan. What's not reasonable is acting like my success means I owe you something, while his failures mean he gets rewarded. What's not reasonable is standing here, listening to you tell me that I should be okay with it just because I've done well for myself. I took a deep breath, forcing my emotions back under control. I'm done. Dad, figure it out. I turned toward the door, grabbing my coat off the chair. My father's voice rose behind me, sharp and commanding. If you walk out that door, you're turning your back on this family. I stopped, my hand hovering over the doorknob. For a split second, I thought about all the years I had given, all the sacrifices I had made, all the times I had convinced myself that family meant doing whatever was needed, no matter the cost. Then I turned back, my voice steady, final. No, Dad, you turned your back on me a long time ago. I opened the door and walked out. The next morning, as I stepped into my office, my phone lit up with a flood of missed calls. My father had called 7 times, my mother 5, and Nathan 3. Shortly after, the text messages started rolling in. My father's tone was sharp and demanding, insisting that I call him back immediately. My mother's messages were softer, laced with guilt. telling me how upset my father was and how we needed to talk. Then came Nathan's, filled with sheer entitlement, furious that his car payment had bounced and blaming me for ruining his credit. As I scrolled through the messages, I noticed a pattern. None of them were asking if I was okay. None of them showed any sign of concern for how I felt or acknowledged the years of sacrifices I had made. They weren't reaching out because they cared about me. They were reaching out because they were panicking. Because for the first time in their lives, they were being forced to deal with their own financial responsibilities. By noon, the messages became more aggressive. Nathan had apparently received a call from the bank and was now furious that his payment had been declined. His words dripped with entitlement and resentment, accusing me of being selfish, of deliberately ruining his financial standing. My father, unsurprisingly, followed suit, calling my decision unacceptable and reminding me that I had an obligation to this family. He acted as though my entire existence had been built around fulfilling their needs. As though I had no right to stop. My mother, ever the peacemaker, pleaded with me, telling me this wasn't who I was and that my father was deeply hurt by my actions. I stared at the words on my screen, feeling a strange sense of detachment. My mother was wrong. This wasn't me? No, this was exactly who I was now. Someone who was no longer willing to be used. A few hours later, my intercom buzzed, and the security guard's voice came through. Slightly hesitant, he informed me that a man was in the lobby demanding to see me. He claimed to be my father. The guard paused, waiting for my instructions, likely sensing that this wasn't a normal visit. I closed my eyes, inhaling slowly before responding. I told him to inform the man that I was unavailable. The guard hesitated again before adding that my father was refusing to leave, insisting that he wouldn't move until I came downstairs to speak with him. My fingers tightened around my desk as the weight of years of manipulation pressed down on me. He still thought he could intimidate me into giving in. But not this time. Keeping my voice steady, I instructed the guard to call the police if my father continued to refuse to leave. 20 minutes later, my phone vibrated with a message from my cousin Ryan. He had just seen my father being escorted out of my office building by security and wanted to know what was going on. I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back a simple response. Family disagreement. Ryan's reply came almost instantly. He had always been blunt. Never one to sugarcoat things. About time. He's been using you for years. Something in my chest loosened. So I wasn't the only one who had seen it. That evening, as I sat in my apartment, the last message came through. My father, refusing to acknowledge the reality of what had happened, sent me one final plea, stating that the family was struggling and that I needed to reconsider my decision. His words were carefully chosen, meant to manipulate me back into submission. I read the message twice, my fingers hovering over the screen. Then, with quiet finality, I typed my response, no, and with that, I blocked his number. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. 3 days passed in silence. No calls. No messages. Nothing. For the first time in years, my life felt like it was finally mine. But I knew better than to believe my father would give up that easily. The storm was coming, and it arrived in the form of my cousin Ryan. Late Friday evening, I received a call from him, his voice tight with urgency. He had just spoken with my Uncle Thomas, who had overheard a conversation between my father and the rest of the extended family. A meeting had been called, one I hadn't been invited to. The topic? Me. Ryan didn't hold back. My father was furious, telling everyone that I had abandoned the family, that I had left them struggling when they needed me the most. He was framing the situation as if I had suddenly decided to withdraw my support out of cruelty, conveniently leaving out the part where I had been financially carrying them for years while they secured Nathan's future behind my back. Worse, he was attempting to rally the family against me, making it clear that the purpose of this meeting was to pressure me into compliance. I felt the familiar pang of disappointment, but it was overshadowed by something much stronger, resolve. My father thought he could control the narrative, that he could turn the family against me before I had a chance to speak for myself. He had severely underestimated me. I told Ryan I would be there. The next day, I arrived at my parents' house precisely at 6 in the evening. The moment I stepped through the front door, the air in the room changed. Conversations halted. All eyes turned to me. My father was seated at the head of the long dining table, his expression a careful mask of disappointment. My mother sat beside him, her lips pressed into a thin line. Nathan was sprawled lazily in a chair, looking smug, as if he had already won. Surrounding them were aunts, uncles, and cousins, some looking uncomfortable, others clearly buying into my father's version of events. I didn't bother sitting down. My father exhaled dramatically, shaking his head as if my presence alone was a burden. Maddie, I'm glad you came. We need to talk about what's happened and how we can fix this. Family takes care of each other. And you've put us in a very difficult position. There it was. The guilt trip. The same tactic he had used on me for years. Expecting me to fold under the weight of obligation. But I wasn't that person anymore. I met his gaze. My voice steady. Fix this? You mean, convince me to start paying for everything again? Because that's not happening. My Uncle Thomas, usually quiet in family matters, cleared his throat. Richard, Maddie has a point. We've been hearing different things about what's really going on. He turned to me. Your father said you walked away when they needed you most. Is that true? I pulled a thick envelope from my bag and placed it on the table. That, I said, is a fully documented record of every single financial contribution I have made to this family over the last 6 years. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle before continuing. I have covered property taxes, house repairs, Nathan's car payments, credit card debts, medical bills, family vacations. The total? I pushed the envelope forward. Over $126,000. A murmur rippled through the room as my father's jaw clenched. My mother shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. Nathan scoffed but said nothing. I turned back to my father. You told everyone that I abandoned you. That I just decided to stop helping. But what you didn't tell them was that while I was paying for everything, you were secretly funneling nearly $500,000 into a trust fund for Nathan. The room fell silent. My Aunt Rebecca, who had always been quick to defend my father, narrowed her eyes. Is that true, Richard? My father's face turned an ugly shade of red. That money was meant for the family's future. I tilted my head, unimpressed. Nathan is the family's future? Because I didn't see a single cent set aside for me. Nathan, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. This is ridiculous. You've always made more money than me. You're acting like a victim when you don't even need the help. I turned to him, my patience razor thin. And why do you need help? Nathan, you're 28. You have a fully funded trust. A lifestyle that you haven't earned. And yet you still expected me to keep covering for you. Tell me, when exactly were you planning on supporting yourself? Nathan rolled his eyes, but I saw the flicker of embarrassment behind them. I looked back at my father. And the worst part? You didn't just expect me to pay for everything. You assumed I would do it forever. Even after I found out about the trust fund, you still thought I'd cover the taxes, the house, Nathan's lifestyle, and when I said no, you called this meeting to turn everyone against me. Another murmur spread through the family. My father's grip on the armrest of his chair tightened. We did what we thought was best for the family. I let out a cold laugh. No, you did what was best for Nathan and expected me to foot the bill. My Uncle Thomas, who had been flipping through the documents, let out a low whistle. I had no idea. Maddie, I think it's safe to say none of us did. I took a step back, exhaling slowly. I didn't come here to ask for permission. I came here to make one thing very clear. I am done. I will not be paying for another bill, another repair, another luxury expense disguised as a family necessity. You will figure it out, just like I had to when I was struggling. And you told me there was no money to help me. My father's expression darkened. Maddie, you'll regret this. I met his gaze, unwavering. No, Dad, for the first time, I won't. I turned on my heel and walked out. And this time, no one tried to stop me. 3 days passed, and for the first time in years, my phone remained silent. No calls, no messages, no guilt-laced attempts to drag me back into the role I had played for so long. It was as if my absence had finally sunk in, and they were realizing I was never coming back. I had expected to feel sadness. Maybe even regret. But all I felt was relief. The weight I had been carrying for years was gone. I no longer checked my bank statements with a sinking feeling. No longer hesitated before agreeing to my own personal expenses. No longer woke up dreading the next family crisis I would be expected to fix. For the first time in my life, my money was mine, my future was mine, and my decisions were no longer dictated by obligations I never agreed to. But, as expected, the silence didn't last. A week later, I received an email from my Uncle Thomas. He had spoken with several other family members since the meeting, and the truth had spread fast. My father's carefully controlled narrative had unraveled. The more they learned about what I had truly contributed over the years, the more people began questioning my father's actions. Apparently, he wasn't handling it well. Shortly after, a message came through from an unknown number. It was from my cousin Ryan. You should know that your father has started reaching out to family members for money. He's claiming that without your help, the property taxes and overdue bills are becoming a problem. But no one is willing to help him. Too many people now know the truth. I read the message twice, letting the irony of it settle in. The man who had spent years telling me there was never enough money to help me, who had guilted me into paying for a house that wasn't even mine, was now looking for financial handouts. And the same family members he had expected to back him up? They weren't playing along anymore. For once, he was on his own. Later that evening, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, another email came through, this time, from my mother. Maddie, I know you're angry, and I understand why. Your father isn't taking this well, and he feels betrayed. I wish things had gone differently. But I also know you've made up your mind. I just want you to know that I miss you. And I am proud of you for standing up for yourself. Even if it hurts. I stared at the words, my chest tightening. My mother had always been the quieter force behind my father's decisions. The one who stayed in the background while he dictated how things should be. But maybe, just maybe, she had known all along that what they were doing to me wasn't right. I didn't respond, not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't ready. Instead, I closed my laptop, grabbed my phone, and transferred $126.500 into my personal investment account. The same amount I had poured into my family over the years. But this time, it wasn't for them, it was for me. For once, I was finally building my own future. The next morning, as I stepped out onto the street, feeling lighter than I had in years, a single message from my father came through. The property taxes are due. You need to take responsibility. I didn't even hesitate before deleting it. It was never my responsibility to begin with. This story isn't just about money, it's about self-worth, boundaries, and breaking free from toxic expectations. For years, Maddie was made to believe that her success meant she owed her family everything, while her brother was handed a future without ever earning it. But in the end, she reclaimed what was hers, not just her finances, but her power. What do you think? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up for yourself, even when it meant walking away? Comment 2 if you liked this story and 7 if you didn't. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Your support means everything, and trust me, there's more to come.